I've been living in this 600 square foot studio apartment for a year and a half now, and over the last year and a half, I've come up with a lot of tips through trial and error and just playing around with my space that I really feel make a studio space very efficient, very comfortable to live in, and really getting the most out of your space. So in this video, I wanted to share 5 tips that I feel are essential to anyone living in a studio, especially a small studio. But before we get into that, hi, my name is Jacob. Welcome to my channel. This is my corner of the internet where every week I yap about things I'm interested in. If you enjoy this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a like, and if you want to come yap with me every single week, be sure to hit that subscribe button as well. That really helps me out. And if you want to see an in-depth tour of this space where I kind of talk through everything, talk about where I got things, be sure to watch my apartment tour that I'll link below, or there should be a card that'll pop up on the screen and you can watch a tour of this space where I kind of talk through it. So without further ado, here are my 5 tips for anybody living in a studio space. Tip number 1 is defining specific zones within your studio apartment. The number 1 easiest way to make your studio not feel like just a giant rectangle or a square that you're living in is being really intentional through the layout, through the decor, and through the furniture that you use to define specific zones within your studio space. For example, with the living room we're in right now, one of the primary ways I define this space from the rest of my apartment is having a large area rug that kind of anchors this and designates this as the living room. And it's a pretty significant contrasting color from the flooring I'm in, so it really kind of sets this off as its own specific zone rather than just kind of an area floating in my studio. I was also really intentional with the furniture about placing the couch that I'm on facing away from the rest of my apartment and not really having my living room be a zone that you can walk through. So it really feels like it's its own dedicated space rather than just kind of an area you're passing through in the larger area of my apartment. And the way I've laid out the rug, the couch, and the little kind of shelf thing I have over to the right, I've kind of created almost a faux hallway on the floor that you walk by the living room, rather than, like I said before, having it where you walk through the living room and it's not really like its own specific space. And I think the ability to not walk through this space is one of the things that really defines it as its own zone. If the orientation was flipped around and like the couch was over here and the TV was over there, and you had to pass through the living room to get to the rest of the apartment, I feel like it would feel kind of just more of like a transitional space rather than this being the actual living room, quote unquote. Air quotes, because there are no rooms in here. It's a studio. And obviously this isn't always going to be possible depending on the layout of your apartment, but if you can have areas that are kind of its own separate space that you can't just pass through to get to another space, I would highly recommend that, and I think it's going to really help you optimize your space. And this doesn't have to be with just the furniture too. I did something very similar with my office, quote unquote. You can see over in my office, I have a very large gallery wall that takes up the entirety of the wall that's above my desk space. I really feel like that gallery wall kind of anchors my desk to that space and gives it a little bit more context where it feels like its own designated zone rather than just being like a desk sitting in the middle of my apartment. And similar thing with my bedroom area. I have my bed back over there and I have the closet kind of going across the wall in the back, and I think having the closet next to the bed kind of makes that feel more like a bedroom space. I think it would be really weird if I had the living room over there and then just my clothes were hanging, or if I had my desk next to all my clothes hanging. Kind of just thinking about like the context of where things are placed and where you have everything organized. I think the layout that I have back over there really does make that feel more like a bedroom and not just like, hey, my bed's here in the middle of this apartment. I haven't really used like curtains or partitions, but that would be something to experiment with as well if you really want to kind of define a space and have like things closed off. Maybe invest in some track curtains that can kind of go across the ceiling, or just like some stand-up dividers that can kind of block the visual sight of a space from the rest of the other spaces. Really kind of think about playing around with how you can define different spaces and how you can make spaces feel more of a actual designated space rather than just kind of like stuff sitting around in your apartment essentially. Tip number 2 is stick to the staples. Living in a studio, you're going to have to be very, very, very intentional about what you're bringing into the space, because it is very easy for the space to get cluttered up and for something that might seem small when you buy it to end up having more visual impact and taking up more space than you ever intended. Ideally, anything you bring in has at least 2 uses rather than having one specific thing for every individual task that you need or every individual function in your apartment. For example, my microwave is a microwave, but it is also an air fryer and an oven as well. So I don't need a specific microwave, a specific air fryer, and like a toaster oven. Or like with my pots and pans, for example, I've got just a handful of pots and pans that are really, really versatile and can cook a wide variety of dishes rather than having like 3 or 4 skillets, 3 or 4 different sizes of pot. Really being intentional about how many uses I can get out of the objects that are in my apartment and how much space they take up is really going to be essential, because space is going to be at a premium. Fortunately, in my studio, I have enough space to have like a designated living room area and my bed as well. But if you're in a smaller studio apartment, you might even consider getting a sofa bed that has like a pull-out bed in it so that you don't have to have a specific bed zone and a living room zone. Or like with my living room, for example, I don't really have space to have like a dining table and a full dining setup. So I got a coffee table that's big enough that I can have dinner in here and when I have people over. Granted, I can't fit a ton of people here, but really the only person that comes over here is my boyfriend because I got a studio specifically because I wanted a small space. That might be something to consider too. Who's gonna be in your space and what kind of functions you need. And the lack of space in a studio leads me into tip number 3, invest in visually appealing storage. If you're living in a studio space, storage is always going to be a premium and you're always going to need more storage. But being a studio where you can see pretty much your entire space throughout any point in your apartment, investing in high quality or at least just visually appealing storage is going to be really essential for making a cohesive space and a space that you actually enjoy being in and not a space that just seems like super cluttered and very overwhelming to look at. You'll see in my apartment, for example, I'm particularly a fan of like mid-century furniture. So I have a lot of like nice antique mid-century pieces and pretty much every single piece of furniture in my apartment has some level of storage. You'll see I have like several dressers in here. Even my like entertainment center has storage. My little station that my sewing machine on has storage. The vast majority of your furniture pieces in your studio space need to have some sort of storage because you don't really have the square footage to just have like furniture pieces that aren't really serving a function, unfortunately. And I would recommend opting for closed storage rather than open storage because having a bunch of open shelves or like those open kind of cubby containers, you're just going to be able to see all of that stuff. And especially in a studio where you can see everything from pretty much every angle, having open storage is just going to be a lot of visual clutter. And I promise in the end, you're going to want to just get closed storage anyway. So just start with closed storage. And if you have like open storage, like those cube organizers I have in the back, get those little storage bins that you can put inside them. So it's kind of like a closed storage solution in an open storage solution. Or if you do want some open storage, try to get furniture pieces that have a blend of open and closed storage. For example, this shelf over here next to my living room has open storage on top, but it also has cabinets and a little pull-out cabinet on the bottom so that I have spaces to store things that I don't want people seeing, like my tools and other equipment. And storage doesn't have to be a super expensive thing. A lot of the furniture pieces in my apartment are like cabinets and dressers and credenzas that I just got on Facebook Marketplace at a discount. So you don't really have to spend a ton of money to do this. I would just recommend getting something with some sort of drawer, some sort of door, some sort of like pull out, and it's not just open shelves where things are sitting on. It's just gonna add a lot of clutter. It's gonna add a lot of mess and you're just gonna be staring at your objects all the time. And sometimes it's just nice to put things away. I know we have nice things that we want to show and there's display options for that, but not every possession that you need to have needs to be seen, especially in a studio space. Tip number 4 is going to be taking advantage of vertical space, both for decoration and also storage, because on the ground, you're only going to have a limited number of square feet. So playing with the wall and using that vertical scale is going to be your best friend. You'll see in my apartment, I have a lot of artwork across my apartment and a lot of it is up across the entire wall. I have things up high, I have things a little bit lower, and playing with that height not only is going to give you more real estate to mess around with, but it's also going to make your apartment seem bigger in my opinion, because it draws your eye up, gives you a little bit more to look at, and just kind of enhances the space. And you'll see it throughout my apartment. I have like not just artwork on the walls, but I have vinyl storage. I have like a cabinet mounted in my kitchen where all my spices are at. I have like tapestries that I've made. I have awards and things like that. Really utilizing the wall is going to be your best friend. And especially if you have tall walls like I have, take advantage of that height. Use those walls, use them for everything that you need. Like I mentioned in my kitchen, I have shelving that was already installed in there, but on top of my stove, I found a little cabinet storage thing for like $10 on Facebook Marketplace, mounted that above my stove, and now I have storage for all my spices and all of my condiments and things like that, which frees up my counter space and the lower cabinet space in my kitchen, which is already super limited and super small. And when I say use that vertical space, I mean all of the vertical space. Use your ceiling if you even need to. That's what's going on with my storage for all of my clothes in the background. I didn't install this personally. The person who lived in this apartment before me did, and I just paid her for all of the materials and asked her to please leave it because I really liked it. But what she did was drill hooks into the ceiling and then suspended these like thick wooden dowels with rope from the ceiling, and that created an entire closet solution. So because of that, I can have like 2 rows of clothing rather than just like one kind of clothing rack to really take advantage of that vertical space, because there are so many ways you can get creative with like wall mounting, hanging from the ceiling, so on and so forth. They can really maximize your studio space and really optimize every single square foot that you have. And my last tip is make your space a representation of you. Now, this is something that can apply to any apartment and is pretty much the goal in any sort of living situation, but especially in a studio, you're gonna be able to see everything from pretty much any angle that you're at. So really make sure that you're investing in things that are representative of you, make you happy, bring you joy, and make the space feel like a representation of yourself. Like I love going on Pinterest and I love looking at TikTok and social media to find inspo and kind of come up with creative ways to express myself and stuff. But if you just like copy some person's apartment from TikTok and put that in your studio, eventually you're gonna get tired of it. You're gonna want to swap things out, and it kind of just becomes an endless pursuit of like cycling trends and cycling styles. To really be intentional, think about what you like, what you're attracted to, what you find interesting, rather than just copying somebody's style from online, because in the long run it's going to make your space a lot more functional. And especially in studios where you're playing with a lot of different shapes and a lot of different layouts, what someone does in one studio may actually not be the best solution for your studio. It might not be the best way of optimizing space, might not be the best way of laying things out. So really be creative and think about your specific space and your specific needs, and kind of think intentional about what you want in those. And it doesn't matter what like design style or what decor style you're going for, there is always a way to inject your personal interest and your personal desires into any sort of aesthetic. For example, I'm someone who's really interested in anime and Studio Ghibli films specifically, so I wanted to have that interest represented in my apartment, but the overall aesthetic that I'm going for is more of kind of like a mid-century sort of feel, so I didn't feel like anime posters was gonna fit that sort of vibe. So I went online, did a lot of digging, and I found an artist who makes these prints that have a little bit more of a muted color palette. They're still vibrant, they're still colorful, but they have that kind of like warm mid-century feel to them, and they are able to show off my interest in those films, but in a way that fits my aesthetic. So sometimes you have to be a little bit creative and do a little bit of digging, but there's always some way to pair your interests with the aesthetic that you're going for. So yeah, those are my 5 tips for living in a studio apartment. I think if you really take those tips into account, you're really gonna get the most out of your studio space, and you're gonna create a space that's really custom to you, really is something that fits your needs, and really is a space that is the best optimized for living your best life in your studio apartment. I know that some people are living in studios because of necessity, or some people live in it because they like the small space. Personally, I like a small space. I think it's a little bit less to maintain. I think it's a little less to keep track of. And overall, just for like one person, I think this is about the space that I need. So I've really been enjoying kind of playing around with decor, playing around with the layout, and making a space that's really custom for me and feels really comfortable for me. And if you live in a studio, I would love to hear in the comments kind of what are some of your studio tips? What are some of the ways that you've made your space custom to you? How have you made your space more comfortable and more functional for the needs that you have? I would love to hear that below, and I would love for us to kind of exchange ideas, because there are tons of different ways you can go about this, and there are tons of tips that can make your space really effective. So yeah, that's all I got for my studio space. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, again, feel free to give it a like, and if you want to come yap with me every single week, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe. If you have any additional questions about living in a studio space or want to know more about how to get the most out of a studio, be sure to leave them in the comments below, and I'll be sure to interact with them. I'm always engaging with my comments, and I'm always appreciative of them. With that being said, that's all I've got for you today, so thank you so much for watching.